Hello and welcome to the fourth lecture of the second week of classes in the Open University's MOOC on genocide. As you remember, this week we're discussing the Rwandan genocide, and today's lecture will focus exclusively on the description of the genocide itself between April and June of 1994. And then towards the end, we'll briefly discuss the world's attitude to the genocide, including in real time, and why no one actually tried to prevent or stop the genocide in Rwanda. And a few words about how the world perceives the Rwandan genocide to this day and how Rwanda itself tries to preserve the memory of the genocide of the Tutsis and foster reconciliation between the former killers, the Hutus, and the victims, the Tutsis. We will discuss all this in the next few minutes. Immediately after the assassination of Rwandan President Habyarimana in early April 1994, an obviously premeditated extermination mechanism was activated the same evening. In the previous lecture, we briefly discussed the proximity between the president's assassination, the immediate manipulative exploitation of that assassination, the holding of the Tutsi, the RPF, and its leader Paul Kagame responsible for the assassination, and the beginning of genocide. First of all, it's quite clear that the last thing Paul Kagame and the RPF should have wanted was to assassinate the man he signed a peace treaty with in August 1993 in the Arusha Agreement we discussed in the previous lecture. Secondly, in retrospect, it's pretty obvious the forces that took power immediately after the president's assassination had operated behind the scenes for many months prior, planning in detail the genocide and elimination of the Tutsis in Rwanda. One notable fact in that regard is the purchase of the weapons used in the genocide. The machetes, those knives used to exterminate nearly 800,000 Tutsis and 100,000 moderate Hutus, nearly 900,000 people in all, were purchased a few months before the genocide and stored in warehouses that were later opened, offering them to anyone the moment the genocide began. Further proof, if you will, that the genocide was premeditated is the fact that months before the genocide began, secret civilian militias were established with quasi-military chains of command. They started being active exactly when the genocide began, as each militia member knew whose orders to follow, who he's in command of, and who he's supposed to work with, in an orderly, methodical, deliberate, and planned fashion. These facts are indisputable. The reactionary right-wing Hutu forces who probably initiated the assassination of President Habyarimana, though to this day not a single person has been accused directly of carrying out the assassination, and supposedly the issue is still unresolved, although any sensible person can see, as I just mentioned, who was behind the assassination. The reactionary right-wing Hutu forces also assassinated top government ministers they deemed too moderate, since they were committed to the peace agreement signed by the assassinated president with the Tutsi and Paul Kagame, the commander of the RPF. They conducted the same premeditated series of events in the genocide of the Tutsis. In the beginning of the course, the first week of school, we spoke about the preconditions for genocide, such as labeling and registration of the population intended to extermination. All these things took place in the case of Rwanda, where the killers knew exactly where to go, who to eliminate, which Tutsi man is intermarried with a Hutu woman, or vice versa, the status of their children, whether they are considered Hutu or Tutsi, and thus the story sets off in a massive, fast, and horrific way. One of the most appalling things in that genocide was the free radio station, the land of 1,000 hills, the name of the inhabitants of Rwanda call the country, in Kinyarwanda, the local spoken language. This famous radio station, which also starred in the excellent film Hotel Rwanda, in case you watched it, used to broadcast light, upbeat, fun African dance music during the genocide, incorporating all sorts of obscene songs and crude talk to attract the undereducated. Between songs, the station's announcers would give orders to the killers, where exactly to go, where Tutsis are hiding, who to eliminate, only the men, only the women and children, or everyone. This was done with all kinds of code words, so no one around the world could say this is a direct order to murder. The Big Job was the name used for the extermination of all Tutsis, no matter what gender or age. Cut the weeds was an order to eliminate the children only. So this station used all kinds of such code names, deploying large quantities of murderers who traveled from village to village, town to town, city to city, receiving their instructions for this brutal murder through the radio. As part of the genocide in Rwanda, and I won't get too graphic, you can expect a great deal of documentation online and of course read the book by Professor Benjamin Neuberger posted on our course website. Unthinkable murders were carried out, with relatives butchering each other, men murdering their wives, or children occasionally informing on the Tutsi parents. Sometimes priests turned in Tutsis, hiding in their church, which is supposedly unthinkable for the Catholic Church. They are supposed to protect the victims in this kind of situation and hide them from murderers. Tutsis find that their blood is fair game everywhere in Rwanda during those 3 months, with nowhere to escape. As stated, this ultimately results in 800,000 Tutsis butchered during those 3 months, alongside some 100,000 moderate Hutu men and women who were considered Tutsi lovers and traitors to their own kind. 900,000 people in total. During this genocide, Kagame, commander of the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, hears about the situation and prepares his army to enter Rwanda. Eventually, after several weeks of fighting, they take over Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, essentially ending this horrifying genocide. No one else in the world bothers to prevent the genocide, let alone stop it after it started. Rwanda's neighboring African countries don't lift a finger. After all, it's quite clear that a battalion of soldiers armed with rifles can easily stop a crowd of rioters holding machetes. No one even considers trying that clever trick. The UN fails to get the Security Council to vote on taking action in Rwanda, mainly due to the fact that the United States is revealed in all its weakness, including moral weakness, with regards to the situation in Rwanda. As you may remember, the President of the United States at that time in 1994 was William Jefferson Clinton, the famous Bill Clinton, known better for other situations during his 2 terms. Clinton is relatively new in office at the time, about a year and a half in power, and his advisors from the State Department tell him, "Look, Mr. President, a genocide is taking place in Rwanda." But he takes the advice of other advisors and tells the press, "There is no genocide in Rwanda, there is an ethnic conflict there." Thus, the US effectively abandons its responsibility to go to the UN Security Council and call for a vote mandating a military operation in Rwanda. 4 years later, in 1998, the same Clinton publicly apologizes on behalf of the United States, saying, "We were wrong, we sinned, we are sorry." By the way, today Clinton is the head of a very large international fund for the restoration of Rwanda, so he might be forgiven for his very first problematic reaction. Other international organizations also do nothing. The UN holds a peacekeeping force in Rwanda, a few hundred soldiers strong, including quite a few Belgian soldiers. When the genocide starts, the Hutu rioters murder some of the Belgian soldiers, and the Belgian government, the former colonial ruler of Rwanda, as you remember, ordered the immediate evacuation of troops from Rwanda. The truth is that it's hard to blame the Belgians. What exactly would we do in that situation? Did Israel consider sending soldiers to help the Tutsis in Rwanda? It sounds almost absurd to us Israelis. why should we expect a country such as Belgium to do the same thing and watch coffins of the dead soldiers return home entangled in a conflict they are not involved in? On the other hand, quite a few people say that Belgium is responsible for sowing the seeds of hatred between the Hutus and Tutsis. You remember the lecture this week where I described to you how Belgian racism permeated into Rwandan society and eventually led to that genocide. Some say Belgium should have done something. They did not. A few years after the genocide in 1998, Belgium passes a law allowing any citizen to sue anyone around the world for committing a crime against humanity or genocide. Belgium is the first country to embrace this trend as an admission of guilt or an attempt to correct its blatant inadequacy in 1994. Finally, I'll say a few words about the role of France. France was the closest ally of Rwanda. For decades, the French presidents were closest to the president of the Second Republic, Habyarimana. There is no doubt that France considered Rwanda not only an ally, but also a country that depends on France economically to a great extent. And truth be told, France had military troops in Rwanda during the genocide of 1994. And as we know from various testimonies, those soldiers sometimes turned Tutsis over to Hutu thugs, leading them to their deaths, knowingly or not, though we don't know if they received direct orders from the Élysée Palace in Paris. France was the country that could have stopped the genocide as Rwanda's closest ally, but they didn't lift a finger. Actually, until recently, a little over than 2 years ago, France officially claimed that Paul Kagame and the RPF were somehow responsible for the genocide in Rwanda and the assassination of President Habyarimana, and therefore are considerably responsible for sparking the genocide, or at least for the main escalation towards its outbreak. Generally speaking, those are the main examples of complacency, short-sightedness, and appalling inaction in the genocide in Rwanda. This completely illustrates how the 1948 UN Convention we reviewed here on the first week of classes, although written and ratified by most countries belonging to the UN, is almost worthless when it comes to practical application, when it's time to implement the convention and stop or prevent genocide before it happens. The genocide in Rwanda is clear proof of that. Towards the end of our fourth lecture this week, I'll say a few words about what happens in Rwanda from 1994 to the present day. Paul Kagame, the RPF commander, eventually becomes the ruler of Rwanda to this day. For a certain period, he serves as prime minister, and in recent years, he has served as president of Rwanda. I won't start evaluating the degree of democracy that exists in Rwanda right now. There are many arguments about it. To his credit, Kagame's regime also made sure to include both Hutus and Tutsis in the government. I already told you in one of the previous lectures that it's currently illegal in Rwanda to label people and say what ethnicity they belong to. It is a criminal offense, which Kagame and his government decided to ban. Kagame and his administration also undoubtedly improved the economic situation of Rwanda in the last 20 years. Especially in recent years, Rwanda's economy is soaring. Kigali, the capital city of Rwanda, underwent a major upgrade and has become a real city, resembling cities in places that are generally considered technologically advanced. Yet, there are still numerous problems in Rwanda when it comes to relations between Hutus and Tutsis. Right now, I won't go into the various charges made against Kagame in the last few years for sending troops to neighboring Congo and Rwanda's involvement in the Congo Civil War, which ended recently. Before we finish, I will mention just one more interesting thing Kagame's regime in Rwanda is responsible for: the truly admirable and interesting attempt to foster a reconciliation between the former killers and victims. This reconciliation attempt has different facets, such as reconciliation committees throughout Rwanda that have been operating there for many years, allowing former murderers to confess their crimes without punishment. The most impressive museums, such as the Museum of Genocide in Kigali, Rwanda, were established, as well as memorial sites. All kinds of things designed not only to commemorate the atrocities that occurred, but to instill hope for the possibility of reconciliation between former killers and victims in the future. Interesting and advanced educational programs in Rwandan schools that seek to close the gap that once existed between Tutsi and Hutu and create a Rwandan society where the danger of a future genocide is minimized or completely eradicated. That's it for today. Thank you and goodbye. In our last lecture this week, we will meet Professor Benjamin Neuberger, who is undoubtedly considered the leading Israeli researcher on genocide in Africa in general and Rwanda in particular. Goodbye for now.